to this panel, and I'm very happy that we can discuss the affect dimension in various ways. And I'm going more into the history and the theoretical paths of this, the discussion of affect. And maybe you have noted that there is a kind of always switching between emotion, feelings, and affects, which is very typical for this discussion. But I guess one should be very clear about that there are differences when we talk about affect or emotion or feelings. And I'm going to try to talk about this a little bit. I've started working on affect since 2000, and when I speculated about the affective dispositive, then I could have never known, that we are facing today this emotion economy, as Pinar was just, explaining to us. My book, The Desire After Affect, came out in German in 2007, and since then, in these 7 years, there was such a major development in this discussion on affect, and I have done a lot of research on it together with colleagues like Ms. Michaela Ott and Bernd Bösel, who I would like to mention as the co-editors of the book Timing of Affect, which has been already mentioned by Pinar. Let me talk today about when algorithms turn affective. Only 2 days ago at the Transmediale, Antoinette Rouvroy talked about the meaninglessness of data. Algorithms don't mean anything, she said in the discussion together with Matteo on this panel, unless they are interpreted, unless they are calculated, which make them very useful, she said, in the sense that they allow those who work with them to create personification without a person, without a subject. Now, if we take up this line of thought and combine it with the topic of the panel here, this means we combine the meaningless algorithms with affect, a highly contested zone, a new image of technology, a new way of a technical assemblage emerge, which I would like to call affect technology or algorithmic psychotechnology. Affect is asocial, apersonal, individual. This is a definition as Brian Masumi has it. This highly meaningless affect can easily be combined with the earlier mentioned meaningless data flow. A few years ago, I've introduced the term of an affective dispositive, following Michel Foucault's dispositive of sex, which he defines as a discursive structure within which power, law, and truth are intertwined in such a way as to be articulated in both institutional practices and in the desire of individual subjects. Today, the enthusiasm with which affects are habitually embraced points to a dispositive of affect. But whereas in the 3 volumes of his History of Sexuality, Foucault was able to presume concepts of knowledge and truth that surround this human being, inserting it into a matrix of technologies of discipline, knowledge and truth have now been replaced by techniques of control, whose basis lies in digital recording and computing systems. What remains is affect as intensity, desire, and life force, as an interval of time that eludes the subject at the same time as reactively inserting it into its world, as a coordinator of perception and world filter, as a primal motivation system that drives us, adapts us, and keeps us alive. Foucault perceived the crisis of government at the end of the 1970s, anticipating the problematic transition from technologies of discipline to those of security long before September 11, 2001. Whereas disciplinary systems presume a prescriptive norm, the starting point of security technology is the empirically normal, serving as a second-order norm and allowing further differentiation. The technologies of security no longer distinguish between permitted and forbidden, instead defining an optimum medium. Applying Thomas Lemke's analysis of the government of risks, in which he traces the development from eugenics to genetic governmentality to the affective dispositive, it becomes clear that this dispositive installs an affective conjunctive. When I said earlier that affect is apersonal, That doesn't mean affect is not subjective, in the sense of grasping a body and the mind of human and other beings. Affect, and I'm getting closer now to the topic of our panel, has to be understood as a multi-spread zone for interventions. I would want to name only the two major forces here: neuroscience and affective computing research on the one side, cultural and media studies on the other side, with a new and very strong interest in material aspects, and both crossing, at least this is my view, crossing at the intersection of affect. For Anglo-American cultural studies, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick's introduction of Sylvan Tompkins' affect theory into cultural and media studies was crucial. The publication of Shame and Its Sisters, a Sylvan Tompkins reader, which she edited with Frank Adam in 1995, marked the beginning of a new era. And Tompkins was the teacher of Paul Ekman. You have already heard from Pinar. The US psychologist Sylvan Tompkins bases his model of affects on a system of affect pairs. Positive affects are interest and curiosity, joy and excitement. Neutral affects are surprise and dismay. Negative affects are stress and fear, terror and shock, anger and fury, disgust, and above all, shame. This latter is understood by Tompkins as the central affect. When Tompkins lists as affects are referred, what Tompkins lists as affects are referred to in other contexts as emotions or feelings. It is important to emphasize this distinction, as these terms are treated with great negligence in literature, where cognitive psychologists of emotion and neurobiology propose very different classification and models for affect, emotion, and feeling. And we will see these later in Affective Computing, where Rosalind Pickard very generously mixing up these three notions all the time. Tompkins developed his work in the 60s and in the late 50s and 60s at Princeton. He broke off his own psychoanalytical treatment, and he was familiar with the ideas of Jacques Lacan. Subsequently, Tompkins developed his affect theory as explicitly distinct from psychoanalysis, because he considered A, that the system of drives it worked with was too small to act as an all-encompassing model, and B, that it has ignored shame as the key affect. In his system, the affects constitute the primary system of motivation for the human being, with the Freudian system of drives as a subsystem. The central affect among the basic affects is shame, which structures the entire psychophysical organism and develops itself as the basic component via the suppression of interest and curiosity. Tompkins defines his affects by analogy with the then increasingly popular systems theory. His affects stand in a dichotomous relationship to one another, depending on its intensity. Neural stimulation causes the affective situation to swing into plus or minus. And actually, this is a very old system. Going back to Aristoteles and to Baruch Spinoza, you can find it just everywhere. That means high intensity means happiness, and low intensity means depression. And actually, this is what you find here when people are measuring, your movements. If you have lots of movements, then you are a very strong and happy, energetic person. If you don't have this high frequency, then you are supposed to be more on the depressive side. Shame is strongly linked in Tompkins' approach to visibility, especially in the face and its expressive powers. As Tompkins writes, man is of all animals the most voyeuristic. He is more dependent on his visual sense than most animals, and his visual sense contributes more information than any of his senses. Now, it is no coincidence then that Tompkins' cybernetic system of affect sparked such a hype in cultural studies in the 1990s. The understanding of affect he proposed could be perfectly combined with the rapidly spreading procedures for neurobiology, recording and measurement that have since been widely used as an empirical basis in media and computer studies. When we now talk about an affective turn, this can be viewed, or has to be viewed, as the culmination of other turns that have been proclaimed in recent times. think of the performative, the pictorial, or the material turn, whose function is not least to promote a comprehensive reframing of the way we address the subject and society. The use of psychotechniques and the invention of new affective strategies are being further reinforced by current developments in media technology and their social networks. In other words, the focus on affect must be viewed in the context of a rediscovering of the body, movement, tactility, and the promise of immediacy as key variables, as well as the dissolution of the boundaries of the technological dispositive. In their introduction to Tompkins' work, Kosofsky-Sedgwick and Adam Frank stressed the narrowness of Freud's concept of the drives and the potential benefits of Tompkins' system of affects for the humanities. For their affects are viewed by Tompkins in terms of freedom, and he uses the cybernetic metaphor of a complex system to show how the different levels with their specific degrees of freedom. According to this model, the computer is freer than the calculator, which can only perform specific calculations, whereas the computer as a universal machine can process everything: image, sound, and language. Affect, unlike the drives, that's a quotation by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, has a degree of competency and complexity that affords it the relative ability to motivate the human to a greater degrees of freedom. For freedom is measured quantitatively in degrees of cognitive competency and complexity. Tompkins even proposes a principle for freedom, suggesting Freud's pleasure principle as the model. He calls it the information complexity or degrees of freedom principle. Sylvan Tompkins was one of the teachers of Paul Ekman, and it's due to Ekman's work that Tompkins' ideas of affect slowly got into the emerging field of affective computing. For Tompkins, affect is primarily facial behavior, or as he puts it, we regard the relationship between the face and the viscera as analogous to that between the fingers, forearm, upper arm, shoulders, and the body. The finger does not express what is in the forearm or shoulder or trunk. It rather leads and follows the movements in these organs to which it is an extension. The face does not serve as a site for readouts of internal states, and it is not only social display rules that make it difficult to read or recognize emotions. Rather, our tendency to experience multiple contradictory affects at the same time, assembled with one another as well as with cognitions and drive states, makes facial affect difficult to assess. These complex emotional assemblages are embedded in scripts that serve to negotiate our motivational realities, and while these scripts may be somewhat visible on the face, the old-fashioned word for this would be character. They require interpretation, something which a good therapist might be skilled. Ekman's research started in the late 50s, focusing on hand movements and gesture. It wasn't until 1965 that he became interested in facial expression and emotion after receiving a grant from the Advanced Research Projects Agency of the Department of Defense to examine cross-cultural studies of non-verbal behavior. This is actually very important, to keep in mind that this research was very highly paid and made possible by the Defense Department in the US. In 1967, Ekman traveled to Papua New Guinea to further study nonverbal behavior of the Fore people, an isolated Stone Age culture located in the Southeast Highlands. His research provided the strongest evidence to that Darwin, and not Margaret Mead, for instance, was correct in claiming facial expressions. They are universal. Ekman had then developed with Friesen the first and only comprehensive tool for objectively measuring facial movement, the so-called facial action coding systems, published in 1978 and revised in 2003. Now, I jump over to Pickard, to Rosalind Pickard, and I call this from the big brother to pleasing little sister. Pleasing little sister is actually a term Pickard introduces in her description of the affective computing. Against this background, and probably with a very good instinct for what's on air, Rosalind Pickard at the MIT developed in the mid-90s her program of affective computing, which sells today its tool as the most promising, as we have just seen and heard, devices for affective surveillance, for affective computer. According to her, affective computing is computing that relates to, arises from, or influences emotions. Definitions of affect and emotions are thus not developed out of computer research itself, but rather carried over from brain research and psychology. Affective computing thus imports affect as formulated within the humanities into the domain of technological development, taking psychological theories, as we have already heard, of emotion, such as Tompkins and Paul Ekman's facial action coding systems, as a basis for those classification systems upon which the computer, with its decoding of emotion and correspondingly emotionally intelligent response, must rely. Pickard defines emotion as fundamental to human experience, influencing cognition, perception, and everyday tasks such as learning, communication, and even rational decision-making. However, technologists have largely ignored emotion and created an often frustrating experience for people, in part because affect has been misunderstood and hard to measure. And she writes, our research develops new technologies and theories that advance basic understanding of affect and its role in human experience. We aim to restore a proper balance between emotion and cognition in the design of technologies for addressing human needs. You can already hear how often she speaks about emotions, at the same time about affects, then again using the term feelings and so on. So actually what is measured when they measure feelings, affects or emotion, they measure bodily reactions and brain activities, which then are interpreted as happiness, anger, joy, etc., as universal feelings. Within affective computing, the face is only one, of course, a very important field. Others encompass affective body expressions, speech analysis, affective vocal intonations, and for measuring the physiological sensing of emotion, wearables, as we have already seen and heard, will be used as the next step. And there is the Oxford Handbook of Affective Computing is just out. It just came out, and I got it yesterday in Cologne. And there is, it's amazing. It's really amazing to see the list of articles on affective computing. And there is, and this was actually pointed out by Bernd Bösel to me, there was only one article on the ethical aspects of the affective computing industry. But Pickard and her company, or the Affectiva, she has already, she's not working with it any longer, but it was her company. They are not only interested in decoding facial emotions, but also in encoding, in developing software for robots to become emotional, so that they might help people who have problems in understanding emotions, and reacting in the correct way to them. And I'll come to my last point, and it's about autism and affective computing, where we might see how affect actually bridges the gap between personal data flows and algorithmically organized emotional expressions. I would like to mention here the names of Amit Binchevsky and John Durham Peters and their work on autism in digital media, who see a new history emerging between autism and technology. Autistics are often said to be the fittest to cope with the strains of the new media age. A few common not only among researchers, but among autism advocates themselves. For instance, the very famous example by Temple Grandin, you might know or have heard about her. Consider how autistic celebrities and advocate Temple Grandin describes her mind in her own words. I translate both spoken and written words into full-color movies, complete with sound, which run like a VCR tape in my head. She has also said her mind works like a search engine that only finds images. So there is nothing to suggest alienation from technology in this description. To the contrary, it is by technologizing herself that Temple Grandin has recourse to others. Technology brings her closer to other humans. There's another very famous example, Douglas Copeland. the high-tech industry, that's his way of calling it, the high-tech industry is the hothouse for high-functioning autistics, socially forgiving yet technologically demanding. Douglas Copeland, the author of Generation X, among many other books, was one of the first to link autism and technoculture, frequently referring to himself as having a mild case of Asperger's. Copeland's 1995 novel Microserves is about a group of programmers working on the Microsoft campus and living in a geek house. One of them locks himself in his office for months as a latter-day Bartleby, living off a two-dimensional diet, food that could be slipped underneath the door. When his mother suspects that he might be autistic, a co-worker retorts, "I think all tech people are slightly autistic." Autism actually is a good way of focusing out the world to exclude everything but the work at hand. And there is another dimension. SAP, the big international software producing company, has pronounced last year, it was actually in 2013, that they have hired more than hundreds of autistic people. And they said they are looking for people who are thinking in a different way, who has the skills of attention in a very different way. Already in 2012 there was a headline in the New York magazine, they said the diagnosis of autism is just everywhere. Facebook's former head of engineering has stated that Mark Zuckerberg has a touch of Asperger's. Time suggested that the intensely awkward Bill Gates is autistic. A biographer of Warren Buffett wrote that the Oracle of Omaha, with his prodigious memory and fascination with numbers, has a vaguely autistic aura. And I could just go on and on, how many on this spectrum. And actually Pickard in her first article in this Oxford handbook, where she's referring to autism on autistic people who might profit of this affective computer in a very strong way, she uses this slogan, "Are you on the spectrum?" Meaning everybody has to be in a way autistic today, because actually this is the high demand, and we are just trying to get closer or fulfill this demand. Thank you very much.